My name is Isabella Marchetti. I'm 43 years old, and for 18 years I've worked as a neonatal ICU nurse at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, Italy. I've cared for thousands of premature babies, witnessed medical miracles that defied every statistical probability, and watched tragedies unfold that broke my heart in ways I never knew possible. But nothing in my career, not the 24-week preemies who survived against impossible odds, not the twins who were born conjoined and separated successfully, not any of the extraordinary cases I've handled, prepared me for what happened in the early morning hours of October 11th. 2006. That's when Carlo Acutis, a 15-year-old boy dying of leukemia just 50 meters from my ICU unit, appeared in the corridor at 3:17 a.m., grabbed my arm with supernatural strength, and said something that saved a newborn's life. "Isabella, there's a baby thrown in the trash who's still alive. Blue container behind the emergency building. You have 8 minutes before he stops breathing. Go now." I found that baby exactly where he said, and 18 years later, I still don't have a rational explanation for how Carlo knew. I was born in 1981 in Bergamo, a city about 20 kilometers from Monza, into a family of healthcare workers. My father was a pharmacist, my mother a pediatric nurse, though she retired early due to burnout, unable to handle the emotional weight of watching children suffer. From childhood, I understood that medicine was both a calling and a burden, that the privilege of saving lives came with the inevitable pain of losing some. I studied nursing at the Università degli Studi di Milano, graduating in 2003 with a specialization in neonatal care. I chose this field deliberately, drawn to the particular challenges of caring for the most vulnerable patients, babies born too early, too small, fighting for every breath in the first days of life. In 2006, at age 25, I was hired at San Gerardo Hospital's neonatal intensive care unit. It's one of the premier facilities in northern Italy, equipped with state-of-the-art incubators, ventilators, and monitoring systems. We handled the most critical cases: extreme prematurity, congenital defects, babies transferred from smaller hospitals when their conditions exceeded local capabilities. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts, sometimes 16 when we were short-staffed. Constant vigilance, because premature babies can deteriorate in minutes. Emotional whiplash, celebrating when a 26-week baby finally goes home healthy, then dealing with a full-term infant who dies of unexpected complications. I developed the armor that all neonatal nurses develop: clinical detachment balanced with genuine compassion. You learn to care deeply while maintaining enough emotional distance to function when things go wrong. You celebrate victories privately and process losses professionally. You never, ever let yourself believe a baby is safe until they've been home for weeks. My colleagues called me Isabella dei Miracoli, Isabella of Miracles. Not because I performed miracles, but because I had a reputation for accepting the cases other nurses found too heartbreaking. The micro-preemies born at 24 weeks gestation, weighing barely a pound. The babies with severe congenital conditions who might not survive their first surgery. The abandoned infants brought in by police or social services, sometimes in terrible condition. I didn't think of myself as special. I just refused to give up on any baby, regardless of what the statistics predicted. In 18 years, I had seen enough impossible recoveries to know that medical certainty has limits, that sometimes babies survive when every logical projection says they shouldn't. By October 2006, I had been at San Gerardo for 3 years. I was engaged to Marco, an elementary school teacher I had met through mutual friends. We were planning a spring wedding, looking at apartments in Monza, building the kind of stable, ordinary life that seemed almost impossibly normal given the intensity of my work. I wasn't particularly religious. I attended Mass occasionally, Easter, Christmas, weddings, funerals, more out of cultural habit than deep conviction. I believed in medicine, in evidence, in the power of human skill and technology to save lives. If pressed, I would have said I believed in God in an abstract way. But that belief didn't particularly shape my daily life. All of that was about to change. Working in a neonatal ICU means existing in a state of controlled crisis. At any given moment, you're monitoring multiple babies whose conditions can shift from stable to critical without warning. You develop an almost supernatural awareness of subtle changes, a slight color shift in the skin, a change in breathing pattern, a deviation in heart rate that might signal something catastrophic developing. You also develop strict emotional protocols. You don't name the babies. You use their last names or bed numbers until they're stable enough that attachment feels safe. You don't make promises to parents about outcomes. You don't allow yourself to imagine the futures of the babies you're caring for, the first steps they might take, the schools they might attend, the lives they might live. Because sometimes, despite your best efforts, those futures never happen. In my 3 years at San Gerardo, I had lost 17 babies. 17 times I had done everything medically possible and watched a tiny life slip away despite our interventions. 17 times I had to walk out to waiting rooms and tell parents that their child was gone. Those losses accumulated like stones in my chest. Each one left a small wound that never quite healed. I didn't talk about them much. Marco knew they affected me, but I couldn't find words to explain the particular agony of watching an infant die, of feeling their heartbeat slow under your hand, of knowing that somewhere in the universe, a life that should have unfolded across decades was ending before it had barely begun. The week of October 6, 2006, we had 3 critical cases in the NICU. Twin girls born at 26 weeks, each weighing barely over a pound, both on ventilators fighting respiratory distress syndrome, and a little boy born at 30 weeks with a severe heart defect, scheduled for surgery that might or might not be successful. I was assigned to the twins, Sophia and Chiara, though I tried not to think of them by those names yet. They were incredibly fragile, their skin so thin you could see blood vessels beneath, their bodies tiny enough to fit in the palm of my hand. The kind of case where you monitor every breath, every heartbeat, knowing that stability can vanish in seconds. On October 6th, as I was ending my evening shift, a teenage boy was admitted to the pediatric ward with fulminant leukemia. I didn't think much of it initially. The pediatric ward was a different unit, different staff, different patients. But word traveled fast through the hospital about this particular case. The boy was 15 years old. His name was Carlo Acutis. He had been healthy just days ago, attending school, active, showing no signs of illness. Then suddenly, devastating symptoms, extreme fatigue, bruising, fever. By the time his parents brought him to the hospital, his white blood cell count was catastrophically abnormal. The speed of the progression was shocking even to oncologists who specialized in pediatric leukemia. Within 72 hours, a vibrant, healthy teenager had become a terminal patient with very little time left. What struck everyone who encountered Carlo wasn't the tragedy of his condition. Sadly, pediatric hospitals see such tragedies constantly, but his extraordinary serenity. Despite being 15 years old and facing imminent death, he maintained a peace that seemed almost otherworldly. Nurses would come back from his room shaken, not by his illness, but by his joy. He talked about computer programming and websites he was building. He consoled his own parents. He asked doctors about their families, showed interest in their lives. He talked about death not with fear, but with a calm certainty that unsettled people who didn't know how to process such acceptance from someone so young. In the days following his admission, Carlo developed a habit of walking the hospital corridors at night when he couldn't sleep, always accompanied by a nurse, always respectful of protocols, but drawn to movement, to seeing other patients, to maintaining some sense of agency over his own dying body. I encountered him twice in those first days. Both times, he was being escorted back to his room by a nurse, and we passed in the corridor. Both times he smiled at me, a genuine smile, not the polite grimace sick patients often give medical staff, and said, "Buonasera." "Good evening." There was something about his eyes, a clarity, an awareness, as if he could see things the rest of us missed. But I was too busy with Sophia and Chiara to think much about Carlo Acutis. The twins were consuming all my attention, every ounce of my skill, all my emotional reserves. The night of October 10th into the morning of October 11th was my scheduled overnight shift. I had been at the hospital since 7 p.m., monitoring the twins and the little boy with the heart defect, whose surgery had been scheduled for October 12th. Sophia and Chiara were stable as 26-week preemies can be. Their oxygen saturation was holding, their vital signs were within acceptable ranges. Their tiny bodies were fighting with the fierce determination that premature babies somehow possess. The NICU at night has a particular quality. The lights are dimmed to simulate day-night cycles for the babies. The only sounds are the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft hiss of ventilators, the occasional cry from babies strong enough to make sound. There's a hush, a reverence, as if everyone understands they're in a space where life is being held by the thinnest of threads. I was standing at Sophia's incubator at 3:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because I had just checked it, noting it on her chart when I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see one of the other nurses or perhaps a resident checking on the babies. Instead, it was Carlo Acutis. He was wearing his hospital pajamas, blue cotton with white stripes, and slippers. He looked incredibly thin, his illness evident in the hollowness of his cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes. But his expression was alert, intense, urgent in a way I hadn't seen in my previous brief encounters with him. "Isabella," he said, and I registered with a small shock that he knew my name, though I had never introduced myself. "I need you to come with me right now. There's a baby who needs you." My first instinct was professional concern. A patient from the pediatric ward shouldn't be wandering into the NICU, especially a terminal patient in the middle of the night. This was a violation of protocols, potentially a sign of confusion or disorientation from medication. "Carlo," I said gently, using the tone I reserved for confused patients. "You need to go back to your room. Let me call a nurse from your ward to escort you." He grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, impossibly strong for someone in his condition. "There's no time, Isabella. A baby has been thrown in the trash. He's still alive, but you only have 8 minutes before he stops breathing." The statement was so absurd, so specific, that it stopped me cold. "What are you talking about? What baby?" "Outside," Carlo said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Behind the emergency building, there's a blue container. A newborn baby, premature, about 32 weeks. He was born approximately 2 hours ago and abandoned. He's wrapped in a pink towel inside a white plastic bag. If you don't find him in the next 8 minutes, he'll die of hypothermia." The level of detail was staggering. Not, "I think there's a baby somewhere," but precise, specific information. Location, container color, gestational age, time since birth, wrapping description. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that this was a confused, dying teenager having some kind of delusion, that I should get him back to his room, alert his medical team, return to my patients. But something else, some instinct I had learned to trust over 3 years of neonatal nursing, some awareness of when something was desperately wrong, even if I couldn't explain how I knew, was screaming that I needed to listen. "Carlo, how do you know this? How can you possibly know there's a baby outside?" His eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw something that made my skin prickle. Not confusion, Not delusion, but absolute, unshakable certainty. Because I can hear him crying, Isabella. And right now, you're the only person in this hospital who can save him. I stood paralyzed for several seconds, my mind racing through options. I couldn't leave my patients unattended. But if there really was an abandoned baby outside, if this wasn't a delusion, every second mattered. "Wait here," I told Carlo. I quickly checked that Sophia and Chiara were stable, alerted another nurse to watch them, and made a decision that violated every protocol in my training. I was going to follow a dying teenage patient's directions to search for a baby that probably didn't exist. We walked through the hospital corridors in silence. It was approaching 3:20 a.m., and the hospital had the eerie quiet of deep night, skeleton staff, emergency lights casting long shadows, the distant sound of a code being called on another floor. Carlo moved with purpose, guiding me through hallways I knew well, toward the emergency building at the rear of the hospital complex. With each step, my rational mind insisted this was madness, but my body kept walking, following this impossible boy toward an improbable rescue. The emergency building at San Gerardo is a separate structure connected to the main hospital by a covered walkway. Behind it, in an area not visible from patient rooms or main corridors, sit several large waste containers, medical waste, general trash, recyclables. As we approached the back exit, Carlo pointed toward the containers. "The blue one," he said. "Third from the left." The October night air hit me like a slap. Cold, probably around 8 degrees Celsius, with a dampness that penetrated clothing. I could see my breath condensing in small clouds. The waste area was poorly lit, just a single security light casting harsh shadows across the pavement. There were indeed several containers, including a large blue one exactly where Carlo had indicated. I approached it slowly, my heart hammering. Part of me was still convinced this was a wild goose chase, that I would open this container and find nothing but hospital waste, that I would return to the NICU embarrassed and concerned about Carlo's mental state. But another part, the part that had learned over 3 years to trust impossible intuitions, was terrified of what I might find. "He's in there," Carlo said quietly from behind me, wrapped in a pink towel inside a white plastic bag. "You need to hurry, Isabella. His core temperature is dropping." I lifted the heavy lid of the blue container. At first I saw only what I expected: bags of hospital waste, discarded packaging, the usual detritus of a medical facility. Nothing unusual, nothing that looked like... Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it beneath the ambient noise of the hospital and the distant traffic from Via Donizetti. A tiny, muffled cry, not the strong wail of a healthy newborn, but a weak, exhausted whimper. My training took over instantly. I climbed partially into the container, pushing aside bags of waste, following that sound. And there, buried beneath several layers of trash, I found exactly what Carlo had described: a white plastic shopping bag. Inside it, a bundle wrapped in a pink towel, and inside that, a tiny human being, a newborn baby boy, premature but breathing, his skin mottled and cool to the touch, but not yet the gray-blue of severe hypothermia. His eyes were closed, his movements weak but present. He was alive. I have no clear memory of the next few minutes. My medical training completely overrode conscious thought. I pulled the baby from the container, checked his airway, clear, assessed his breathing, rapid and shallow but present, checked his color, pale but not cyanotic, estimated his weight and gestational age, approximately 1.8 kilograms, probably 32 to 33 weeks gestation, exactly as Carlo had said. I stripped off my cardigan and wrapped him against my body for immediate warmth, then ran back toward the hospital entrance, cradling this impossible rescue against my chest. "NICU!" I shouted to a security guard who jumped up from his station. "Call the NICU. Tell them I'm coming in with an abandoned newborn, premature, hypothermic, need an incubator prepared immediately." I was running through corridors, my mind simultaneously processing medical priorities and reeling from the impossibility of what had just happened. I burst into the NICU where my colleagues stared in shock at the bundle in my arms. "Abandoned newborn, found in waste container, approximately 32 weeks gestation, mild to moderate hypothermia, needs immediate warming and assessment." The team moved into action with the practiced efficiency of neonatal specialists. Within minutes, the baby was in a warming incubator, being assessed by a neonatologist, receiving the cascade of interventions necessary for a premature newborn who had spent unknown minutes in 8-degree weather. Only when he was stabilized, when I was sure he was going to survive, did I remember Carlo. I ran back to the corridor where I had left him, empty. I checked the area outside the emergency building. No one. I went to the pediatric ward and found a nurse at the station. "Carlo Acutis, is he back in his room?" She looked at me strangely. "He's been in his room all night, Isabella. He's very weak tonight. He hasn't been out of bed since 10 swing p.m. "That's impossible. He was just with me. He walked me to the emergency building. He showed me where." She was shaking her head. "Isabella, I've been monitoring him personally. He's been in bed, sleeping mostly. He couldn't have left his room." I stood there, my mind unable to reconcile what I knew had happened with what I was being told. The next several hours were a blur of activity. The abandoned baby, whom the nurses had already started calling miracle, was in stable condition, remarkably stable considering his ordeal. His core temperature had dropped to 34.5 degrees Celsius, dangerously low, but not fatally so. His lungs were developed enough to breathe independently with minimal support. Apart from being premature and cold, he was healthy. Hospital administration launched an immediate investigation. How had a newborn been abandoned on hospital property without anyone noticing? Security footage was reviewed. Staff were questioned. Police were called to begin tracking the mother. I gave my statement mechanically, explaining that I had been checking the exterior waste disposal area when I heard a cry. I didn't mention Carlo. How could I? What would I say? That a dying teenage patient had given me precise directions to a baby he couldn't possibly have known existed? By 7 a.m., as my shift ended, I was exhausted and confused in equal measure. Before going home, I went to the pediatric ward one more time. Carlo's room was quiet. His mother, Antonia, sat in a chair beside his bed, her face drawn with grief and exhaustion. Carlo himself was sleeping, his breathing shallow, his body visibly failing. I knocked softly. Antonia looked up. "I'm sorry to disturb you," I said quietly. "I'm Isabella from the NICU. I just wanted to check on Carlo." Her eyes filled with tears. "The doctors say it's very close now. Perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow. He's been sleeping mostly since last night. There was a period around 3 a.m. where he seemed restless, but then he fell back into deep sleep." 3 a.m., the exact time he had appeared in my unit. "Signora Acutis," I asked carefully, "has Carlo mentioned anything about babies, about the NICU?" She looked puzzled. "No, why would he? He's been focused on his own projects, his website about Eucharistic miracles. He talks about that sometimes, even now." She paused. "Although this morning, when he woke briefly around 6 g, he did say something strange." My heart was pounding. "What did he say?" "He smiled. You know how Carlo smiles, even now, even dying. And he said, 'The little miracle is safe now, isn't he, Mama?' I thought he was confused, talking about his own miracles, perhaps. But then he went back to sleep." The little miracle, the exact nickname the nurses had given to the baby I had found. I excused myself and walked out of the hospital in a daze. The morning sun was bright, the October air crisp and clear. Traffic was picking up on Via Donizetti. The world was proceeding normally, completely unaware that something impossible had just occurred. I went home to my apartment where Marco was just waking up for his school day. "How was your shift?" he asked routinely, kissing me good morning. "Fine," I lied. "Quiet night." I couldn't find words to explain what had happened. I barely understood it myself. Over the next 24 hours, more details emerged about the baby. Through investigative work, authorities tracked down his mother, a 16-year-old girl from a nearby town who had hidden her pregnancy from her family. Terrified, overwhelmed, she had given birth alone in her bathroom, then panicked. In her desperation, she had driven to the hospital, abandoned the baby in what she thought was a safe location where he would be found, then fled. She hadn't realized that the waste containers behind the emergency building were emptied only once per week, that the area was not regularly monitored, that her baby, left there at approximately 1:30 a.m., would likely not have been discovered until the weekly pickup 3 days later, by which time, obviously, he would have been dead. The baby survived because I found him at 3:25 a.m., less than 2 hours after abandonment, just before hypothermia became fatal. And I found him because Carlo Acutis told me exactly where to look. I became obsessed with understanding how Carlo had known. I reviewed his medical records. From October 6th to October 10th, he had been seriously ill, receiving aggressive chemotherapy that had failed to stop the leukemia's progression. He had been weak, often nauseated, spending most of his time in bed. I interviewed the nurses who had cared for him. None remembered him leaving his room during the night of October 10th or 11th. The nurse specifically assigned to monitor him swore he had been in bed from 10 p.m. onward, sleeping fitfully, but never leaving. I checked security cameras. The footage from the corridor outside Carlo's room showed no one entering or leaving between midnight and 4 a.m. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that Carlo had physically walked with me to that waste container. I had felt his hand on my arm, heard his voice giving me directions, seen him pointing to the specific blue container. Unless I had hallucinated the entire thing, unless the stress of my job, combined with sleep deprivation, had created an elaborate delusion. But the baby was real, the rescue was real, and I had found him in exactly the location Carlo had described, wrapped exactly as he had said, at exactly the gestational age he had estimated. Coincidence seemed impossible. But the alternative, that a dying teenage boy had somehow known about an abandoned baby through supernatural means, was equally impossible. I tried to see Carlo again on October 11th, but his condition had deteriorated further. He was barely conscious, surrounded by family, clearly in his final hours. I returned to work on October 12th for my next shift. At 7:14 a.m., just as I was beginning rounds, an announcement came over the hospital intercom. Carlo Acutis had passed away. He was 15 years old. He had been sick for less than a week, and in his final days, he had somehow, impossibly, saved a baby's life. The hospital held a small memorial service 2 days later. I attended standing at the back, listening to people who had known Carlo talk about his extraordinary faith, his love for the Eucharist, his computer skills, his joy even in dying. His mother spoke about his final conscious words, spoken the morning of his death. "I'm offering my suffering for the Pope and for the Church." About how he had maintained peace and even happiness throughout his ordeal. About how he had consoled them rather than them consoling him. After the service, I approached Signora Acutis hesitantly. "I'm Isabella from the NICU. I just wanted to tell you, your son was remarkable." She embraced me, crying, "Thank you for coming. Carlo loved this hospital, loved seeing how people work to save lives. He would have been so happy about the baby who was saved. I told him about it, the morning he died, about the miracle baby. He smiled and said, "Yes, Mama, I know." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Did he tell you?" I started, then stopped. How could I ask what I wanted to ask? But Antonia seemed to understand anyway. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much grief, but also held something else, acceptance of mysteries beyond understanding. "My son saw things, Isabella. New things. He always had, even as a small child. He would know when I was sad before I showed it. He would mention things that hadn't happened yet, but would happen days later. We thought it was just intuition, sensitivity. But toward the end," she paused, choosing words carefully. "Toward the end, I think the veil between this world and the next became very thin for him. I think he could see across it in ways we can't." 3 weeks after Carlo's death, I received a letter at the hospital. It was from his mother, Antonia Acutis. "Dear Isabella, while going through Carlo's belongings, I found his journal. He kept detailed notes about many things, his website projects, his thoughts about faith, his prayers. But I found an entry from October 10th, the night before he died, that I think you should see. I'm enclosing a photocopy. With gratitude for the care you showed to the most vulnerable Antonia." The photocopied journal page was dated October 10th, 2006, with an entry time-stamped at 10:30 p.m. Tonight I can barely write. My hands are shaking from the chemo. But I need to record this because it's important. I've been praying intensely for the last several hours, asking God to let me be useful before I die, to let my suffering serve some purpose beyond my own sanctification. And then a few minutes ago, I received an answer. Not in words exactly, but in knowledge that appeared fully formed in my mind. There is a baby who will be abandoned tonight behind the emergency building. A 16-year-old mother, terrified and alone, will give birth and then leave her son in the waste containers, believing someone will find him quickly. But the containers aren't checked regularly. Without intervention, the baby will die. I've been shown that Isabella, the NICU nurse I've passed in the corridors, is the one who needs to find him. She has the skills to save him and the heart to care about why she must try, even when it seems irrational. I don't know how I'm supposed to get this information to her. I'm too weak to leave my bed tonight. But I'm being told, in that same wordless way, that I need to trust that the means will be provided when the moment is right. If this is my last act on earth, what a beautiful gift, to save a life at the moment mine is ending, to be used by God as an instrument of mercy for an innocent child. Tutti nascono come originali, ma molti muoiono come fotocopie. Everyone is born original, but many die as photocopies. This baby will live to be an original, I'm sure of it. I read that journal entry 7 times, tears streaming down my face. Carlo had known about the baby at 10:30 p.m., hours before the mother had even given birth, hours before the abandonment occurred. And somehow, in a way that defied every law of physics and medicine, he had left his deathbed, had walked with me through those corridors, had guided me to that specific container. Or had he? The security footage showed no one. The nurses swore he had been in bed, but the journal entry proved he had known. And I knew I had walked with someone, had heard a voice, had felt a hand on my arm. Maybe what had walked with me wasn't Carlo's physical body, but something else, his spirit, his determination, his will made manifest through grace or divine intervention, or forces I have no names for. Or maybe, in those hours before his death, the boundary between physical and spiritual had become so thin for Carlo that he existed in both states simultaneously. His body dying in bed, while his consciousness moved through the hospital saving a life. I don't have answers. 18 years later, I still don't have answers. What I have is a living, breathing miracle named Luca, the name his adoptive parents gave him after they learned his hospital nickname had been Miraculo. Luca was adopted by Anna and Giovanni Brambilla, a couple from Milan, who had been trying to have children for 8 years without success. They had been in the process of adopting internationally when social services contacted them about an abandoned newborn who needed immediate placement. They met him when he was 3 weeks old, still in the NICU but thriving. When they heard the story of his rescue, they wept. When they learned that a dying teenager had somehow guided a nurse to find their son in the middle of the night, they understood they were part of something larger than themselves. I've maintained contact with the Brambilla family throughout Luca's childhood. Anna sends me photos every year on October 11th, the anniversary of his rescue, showing me how he's growing. Luca is now 18 years old. He's tall, athletic, with a bright smile and sharp intelligence. He's studying computer engineering at Politecnico di Milano. Computer engineering, the same field that fascinated Carlo Acutis. The Brambillas told him his story when he was old enough to understand, about being abandoned, about the miraculous rescue, about Carlo. Rather than traumatizing him, it gave him a sense of purpose. He believes, and his parents encouraged this belief, that he was saved for a reason, that his life has meaning because it was preserved through supernatural intervention. Every year on October 12th, the anniversary of Carlo's death, the Brambilla family makes a pilgrimage to Assisi, where Carlo is buried. They pray at his tomb. They thank him for Luca's life. I've joined them several times over the years. Standing before Carlo's tomb, now a site of pilgrimage since his beatification in 2020, I always bring the same offering, a photograph of Luca, showing Carlo that the baby he saved is growing into a remarkable young man. My own faith was transformed by this experience. I had been a casual Catholic, attending Mass occasionally out of habit rather than conviction. After Carlo, that changed. I couldn't maintain my comfortable skepticism about supernatural intervention when I had experienced it so directly. I couldn't dismiss miracles as superstition when I had participated in one. I started attending daily Mass, like Carlo had. I began praying the Rosary. I developed a deep devotion to the Eucharist because Carlo had loved the Eucharist, had documented Eucharistic miracles, and I wanted to understand what he had understood. My work in the NICU also changed. I had always been dedicated, but after Carlo, I approached each baby as not just a medical case, but as a soul, as someone who might have been preserved for reasons beyond my understanding, as potentially part of divine plans I couldn't see. Marco and I married in 2008. We have 2 children now, Elena, age 14, and Matteo, age 11. I tell them about Carlo Acutis, about how sometimes God uses the youngest, most unlikely people to perform his greatest works, about how death at 15 isn't necessarily a tragedy if that short life accomplishes what it was meant to accomplish. The night of October 10th, 11th, 2006 is the defining experience of my life. It's the lens through which I understand my work, my faith, my purpose. In 2020, when Carlo Acutis was beatified, the news spread around the world. Suddenly, this teenage boy from Milan, whom I had briefly known, was being held up as a model of modern holiness, a patron saint for the digital age. The media covered his story extensively, his love for technology, his devotion to the Eucharist, his joyful acceptance of death, but most coverage focused on his documented miracles, the Eucharistic miracles he had catalogued on his website, the healings attributed to his intercession after death. What they didn't know, what I didn't speak about publicly for many years, was the miracle he performed in his final hours of life, the baby he saved through impossible knowledge and supernatural presence. I'm telling this story now because I believe it needs to be told, because Luca is now an adult, thriving and healthy, because Carlo's beatification has brought attention to his life, because people need to know that miracles didn't stop after the Bible, that grace still operates in the world, that sometimes God uses dying teenagers to save abandoned babies. I know this sounds impossible. I know it defies rational explanation. Believe me, as a medical professional who spent years trusting only in science and evidence, I understand the impulse to dismiss supernatural claims. But I was there. I found that baby in exactly the location Carlo described, at exactly the time he said, wrapped exactly as he indicated. And Carlo's journal, written hours before any of it happened, proves he knew. You can choose to believe this was coincidence, that I misremembered details, that there's some rational explanation I haven't considered. That's your right. But I know what happened. I know that Carlo Acutis, in his final hours of life, used his remaining strength not for his own comfort, but to save a child he would never meet, to perform an act of mercy that required supernatural knowledge and supernatural means. Luca exists because Carlo existed. That's not metaphor or exaggeration. It's literal truth. To anyone working in healthcare who feels overwhelmed by suffering, by cases you can't save, by the weight of bearing witness to pain, remember that sometimes we're used as instruments for purposes we can't fully understand, that our faithfulness in small things might be preparing us for miraculous things. To anyone who has lost someone young and struggles to find meaning in that loss, consider that a life's value isn't measured in years, but in impact. Carlo lived 15 years and saved lives, inspired faith, created resources that millions have used. That's not a life cut short. That's a life completed. To anyone who doubts that God still works in the world, that miracles still happen, that the supernatural still breaks into our natural world, I can only offer my testimony. I was a skeptic. I trusted only in medicine and science, and then I experienced something that shattered my skepticism and rebuilt my faith from the ground up. Blessed Carlo Acutis, pray for abandoned children. Pray for healthcare workers who carry the weight of impossible decisions. Pray for all of us who need to remember that sometimes the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we think, and that love is stronger than death. Every year on October 11th, I return to that blue waste container behind the emergency building at San Gerardo Hospital. It's still there, still in use, completely ordinary. I stand before it and remember, this is where a miracle happened. This is where a dying boy's final act was to save a life just beginning. And I thank God that I was chosen to be part of it.